Таны төлөө эх орон чинь юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуухаас өмнө та өөрөө эх орныхон төлөө юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуу. Young for Jargal. Хүн төлөгчдөө өнөөдөр манай дефактны сүүлгийн зочноор Монгол улсын эдийн засгийн форумд оролцсон Оливер Вайман гэж компани, олон улсын компани түншлэгч партнер Антони Стивенс оролцож байна.
Антони Стивенс Оливер Вайман пүүсийн Аз Номхон далайн салбарын захирал. Кембрижийн их сургуульд математикийн чиглэлээр суралцсан төгссөн Оливер Вайман пүүсийн Умард Америк, Европ, Аз Номхон далайн бүс нутаг дэх салбарт ажилласан туршлагатай. Санхүүгийн бүх төрлийн үйлчилгээ, даатгалын чиглэлээр зөвлөгөө өгдөг. Олон улсын хөгжлийн стратеги, өсөлт, корпорацийн хөгжил, эрсдлийн удирдлагын чиглэлээр зөвлөгөө тусалцаа үзүүлж, аж үйлдвэрийн байгууллагуудтай хамтран ажилласаар ирсэн.
Good evening, Anthony.
Good evening. Nice to be here.
Thank you for coming to this studio. And as I told you, we start about you, who you are, and how you became one of the world young leader.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I've been working for a company called Oливер Вайман for just over 16 years now. And in that capacity I've been a partner for 11 years, and I've been helping to establish our insurance business. Oливер Вайман is a consulting company, and we focus on financial services.
So you made it into insurance?
Into insurance, exactly. And spent 6 years building up our insurance business, initially in Europe.
Well, I want to talk about that insurance deeply. Before that, in 2010, World Economic Forum in Davos had selected 197 young men from 97 countries, including you. And it was a surprise. And what do you think? Why you are there?
It was a surprise. I think if you look at the list of all the other young global leaders, it includes a lot of incredibly impressive people. So to be considered in the same group as them was a surprise and a privilege, I think, as well. I think, why was I selected? I've been fortunate enough, I think, to have been exposed to a lot of opportunities to either lead businesses or establish businesses. And most recently, running the Asia business of Oливер Вайман.
So you are in Singapore now, basically.
I'm based in Singapore now. And I think, partly for that and also for the contributions I've made to various industry groups within financial services.
How did you get connected with Mongolia?
Well, one of my fellow young global leaders, Gan Hutagt, is now the Vice Minister of Finance in Mongolia. Before that, he was the Chief Executive of Tenga Financial Group and of Zakbank.
We have 3 young global leaders from Mongolia in the history of the young global leader, who is a part of this World Economic Forum, Davos, energizing part of it, I understand. So you were invited by another young global leader from Mongolia, Kang Huyak, who is a Minister of Finance, Deputy Minister of Finance. All right, let's talk back about your insurance business. Tell us about you have seen Mongolia, it's an emerging new market. What kind of insurance we should be taking first, organizing in this country? What do you think?
It's a good question, and you're right, Mongolia is at a critical point in its development, and insurance as an industry is relatively underdeveloped in Mongolia at the moment. I think you have only one life insurance company, and I think 15 general insurance companies. Insurance, I think, plays an important role in the economy and in terms of providing social goods for people as well. It provides obviously personal protection against risk, provides a vehicle to accumulate long-term savings, and to cover for the case when the breadwinner in the family no longer is able to earn a living. So I think insurance plays a very important role, and I think it is important for Mongolia's development as an economy and as a society to have a strong insurance industry. that probably means developing a stronger life insurance sector, particularly for long-term savings, and to remove the burden from the state of having to cover all of the potential accidents that can happen to people during their lifetime. I think also, as Mongolia develops its corporate sector, it's important that companies that do business in Mongolia don't have to rely on foreign insurance companies to get the protection they need for their plants and their facilities in Mongolia, and that value remains in the country rather than leaking out of the country.
So the development of national insurance system inside of the country is a key factor for saving.
I think so.
And also saving is a key factor of insurance as well.
Correct. I think there's a chicken and an egg.
Yep. In that connection, how do you find Mongolian banking development today?
Well, obviously Mongolia has been recovering from a financial crisis 1 to 2 years ago, and therefore the banking system is now much stronger than it was 2 years ago. One of the challenges is that Mongolia has huge investment needs in infrastructure and project finance, and in developing its corporate sector outside of mining as well. Having a banking sector that is able to efficiently finance all of that infrastructure investment, I think is incredibly important. Part of that clearly will come from the commercial banks. Part of that also has to come from alternative financing mechanisms. That's why I think it is exciting that the Mongolian Parliament has passed primary legislation to establish a development bank and also to support public-private partnerships.
What do you think about the efficiency of development bank based on real cases? Take a case of Singapore, I believe, a successful one, and what National Development Bank is to pay particular attention to be a success story?
I think there are many cases, some more successful, some perhaps less successful, within the development banking sector. Rather than pointing to any individual success stories, because I think all of them perhaps have a mixture of things which went well and things which perhaps might have been done differently, I think it's maybe better to draw some of the lessons from the development banking experience. One is, I think it's important to have very strong risk management. That's true of all banks. It's particularly true of development banks because the nature of the lending that they do is typically much larger loans. Often the projects that they finance, the risks may be quite difficult to assess. Infrastructure, project finance, and
airports,
so on.
etc.
They're one-off.
What is the best way of risk management of such sort of operations for the bank?
It's a mixture, I think, of governance.
Yeah, certainly on the operation side, yes.
On the operational side, I think it's around having capable people in an independent risk management function that are empowered to challenge, question, analyze individual transactions.
How you will get independent risk auditor for the bank like this? From whom it will consist of?
I think there's a variety of sources. If you look at the background of most risk managers in banks elsewhere in the world, there's no obvious single source. Some of them come from the business side, so you do find a lot of ex-transaction people involved in risk management. Often they can provide a very good internal perspective on risks. You do find a lot of mathematicians, you find a lot of people with an economics background, statistics background, because risk management does have a lot of technical disciplines involved in it. You find some people who come from the regulatory side. You find some people with a legal background. So I think it's important to bear in mind that risk management is not a single discipline. It's a multidisciplinary function. And you need to have people who can cover all different kinds of risks, whether they're operational risks, whether they're financial risks, whether they're credit risks, whether they're reputational risks.
The risk of a development bank is quite close or directly connected with the risk of the country.
Correct.
In particular. And in this country, the economy a lot depends on mining and this commodity cycles, prices. In that sense, risk of the country. from on the market so much. What you would advise on that? How we can take care of better? What kind of structure we need, or things we have to pay attention as a country?
It's a good question. And at the Mongolian Economic Forum today, there was a fairly healthy debate, I think, about whether the natural wealth of Mongolia is a blessing or a curse. And I think it certainly has elements of both. On the one hand, it does provide a huge amount of wealth that can support investment in developing the economy more broadly. On the other hand, it does create a concentration of exposure to commodity prices in particular and to political trade tensions. I think there are both long-term and short-term things that you can do to manage those risks. In the long term, the only way to ultimately manage those risks is to diversify the economy, to build other sectors that can spread the risk in the economy away from just a single
That's
set
what
of
we
asset
try to
prices.
figure out, how to diversify. And I don't, we have traditional agricultural, animal husbandry-based economics companies, but we don't go quite well on that for diversifying, though half of the population is busy with that sector. And yet we talk a lot about the financial sector, development, etc. How realistic is this?
I think financial infrastructure is important as an enabler for other sectors of the economy. I think it's, as the global financial crisis has shown, it can be dangerous to depend too heavily on the financial sector for economic growth. I think the experience of the UK in particular, I'm British, so it's particularly close to home, has shown that if you depend too heavily on the financial sector, it's no different to depending too heavily on the mineral sector. It has its own booms and busts. So I think for an economy like Mongolia that is developing, it's important to view the financial sector as an enabling mechanism to develop a broader, more diverse economy, and also as a mechanism for mitigating shocks to the system.
Yes.
And dispersing those shocks across the broader economy so that you don't have, over time, so that they don't disrupt economic activity too greatly.
We have a quite large government, which is almost two-thirds of economy now, with their spending power. And then yet we have to risk this inside operation risk, then we have this commodity circle outside risk. And altogether, what would be relations of this large government and this financial sector development?
Over time, clearly, the bulk of economic growth has to come from the private sector. The role of the financial sector, I think, is in enabling resources and capital to reach the parts of the private sector where there are attractive growth opportunities, to provide investment to support that growth, and to channel savings which will increase over time as the country becomes wealthier, productively into those growth opportunities.
So basically in the economy, the more value creation is made in private sector.
That's true for most economies.
Yep. Then, so we have, for example, our major airlines, Mongolian national airlines, still owned by the government, and we have a long debate, and every government talks about privatization for now years, 20 years. If you know how it was done with the British Airways. I understand it was a completely government one.
Correct.
Then they have been privatizing, if you recall anything about the British Airways.
It was a long time ago that British Airways was privatised, and there were several other, I think across the whole of Europe, most of the airlines were privatised. I think the experience has been mixed. The airline industry is a challenging industry economically. It's very capital intensive, very cyclical, actually has relatively low barriers to entry, and of course also has a lot of political interference in terms of various constraints on expansion. And as a result, most airlines globally lose money, don't cover their cost of capital.
Japanese airlines.
JAL, I think, is a good example. Obviously, in the US,
Singapore?
Singapore Airlines is an exception to that rule. It's one of the most profitable airlines in the world.
Owned by state?
It is privately owned. It's a listed company.
That's why.
Well, it is partially owned by Temasek, which is a government-owned investment fund.
That's a good question. How big Temasek has share in Singapore Airlines?
I forget the exact percentage.
So could it be a good example where Development Bank, which is Temasek in Singapore, was a good player in the right place at the right time?
I think one of the interesting things about Temasek is that it runs itself very much like a commercial enterprise. It's very much arm's length. It has very clear governance standards. They have strong performance standards. So there is no real political interference in any of the companies which they have.
That's just big wonder about Temasek Holding. How big is Temasek Holding compared to the Singapore economy?
Well, it's north of $100 billion in assets under management. Singapore is 4 million people, 4.5 million people.
How big economy?
And about $40,000 per head, so it's about 160 billion dollars in GDP.
So it is almost half of the economy asset size company today.
Is probably about the same size, but of course it's not a direct comparison because assets is a stock and the economy is a flow.
Yeah,
GDP is
and
a flow.
it also works abroad, not only in Singapore.
Temasek has significant overseas holdings.
How big assets abroad?
I don't know the exact percentage, but they have extensive investments in North America and Europe, and increasingly, of course, in other emerging markets in Asia.
And it is also very well known with its professional staff management, the governance.
And it sources a lot of its staff from the private sector and from the professional asset management and alternative investments.
Well, I hope our new development bank will be quite like that. I wish. Let's talk about capital market development in the country, which is quite in a very infant level. As we have talked today, this morning, there is even a debate, a very, very young industry. What is your take on that? How Mongolia will go? How do you visualize it?
It's a tough question to answer right now because the capital markets in Mongolia are still very much in their infancy. I think the numbers I was hearing today was that a total market capitalization of the actively traded stocks in the Mongolian stock exchanges is $3 billion, and if you look at the Mongolian companies that are listed overseas, their total market capitalization is more like $20 billion. So clearly at the moment, the Mongolian stock exchange is not the first destination for capital raising for many Mongolian companies.
Is it because also the country is very less known, or is not because... why do you think it doesn't work?
Part of it could be just because of infrastructure, and the regulatory framework is still, again, very much in its infancy. If you look at other exchanges around the world, they have been in existence for many, many years. They have a well-established regulatory framework. They have listing requirements that have been tried and tested and refined for many years. So in a sense, it's not surprising. The mineral wealth that Mongolia now has is relatively new, and it's only been 20 years since the fall of the socialist communist regime. So in many ways it's not surprising that a lot of this infrastructure is still in its infancy. It is important to develop it, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is it is important to have a low cost of capital, to have an efficient means of raising capital for Mongolian enterprises. Having a efficient, technologically advanced, and easy to do business in exchange.
Now we're going to work with the London Exchange.
That's what I hear.
Hopefully,
and I think
this infrastructure is coming with them. A question: our government is saying that some strategic deposits-based shares will be sold in Mongolian stock exchange and also in international one. What will be the connection between these two? Because it's the same company, a part of shares are sold here, another sold is there. If there's any such experiences around the world, that you are listed on two markets, one is domestic, one is international, and then how it is related to each other?
There's many examples of dual listings. And I think the reason people do it is because they want to tap into liquidity to investors in different markets. You know, there are many investors in the UK and Australia, or who trade in UK and Australia, who have a strong interest in mining and natural resource companies. If you look at companies like Rio Tinto, that's listed in the UK, if you look at BHP Billiton, those are peer companies that would be comparable to many of the companies from Mongolia that are going to be seeking listings. So I think it's important when you're thinking about a capital raising strategy that you try to position yourself in a way which makes you attractive to the broadest set of potential investors as possible.
It is a part of the same company. Here, sold here and sold here. Could the investor here can go and buy that, or that those shares, or it is to be designated for the particular market?
It varies. Obviously, in China, you do have separate designations where there are restrictions on who is able to buy which designation.
They call it A, B shares, etc.
Exactly. You have the A shares, the H shares.
Is there particular shares in China that only Chinese citizens buy?
Correct. Yeah. Well, there are restrictions on who can buy equities within China and who can trade securities in China.
So, of the same company, shares could be A and B.
Correct.
By ratios or by a certain percentage, 10%?
No, they're separate listings, and sometimes they're separate subsidiaries within the same holding company. So you could have a separate listing of a subsidiary or holding company.
A separate currency, maybe?
And often they'll be denominated in a separate currency. Although in Hong Kong, they've recently enabled RMB denominated equity issuance.
Is it?
Hong Kong.
How big the RMB denominated shares and total market capitalization?
Well, currently it's negligible because it's only just been announced.
Just been announced.
But I think you will see that growing over time. You have currently RMB settlements of trade now recently rolled out to more than 60,000 enterprises in China, and something in the region of 2 or 3% of total imports are now settled in RMB, and that's of course leading to a big increase in the RMB deposit base in Hong Kong, which of course will create demand then for RMB investment vehicles.
Maybe you have heard also that there is certain talk, at least in Mongolia. Government sometimes talks about sovereign bonds of Mongolia. How realistic is this? What is to be the base underlying asset of these bonds? And how big and how long it takes time? What do you think?
There's two fundamental underlying bases for any debt issuance of a sovereign. One is its tax-raising powers, and the second are physical assets which it owns and which generate revenue themselves, commercial revenue, that can be used to create asset-backed bonds or securities. In the case of Mongolia, I can think of both options being potentially interesting.
Do they specify the underlying asset for any sovereign bond? Issue the bonds? Typically,
those are done, I mean, in the US, that's more done at the municipal level, where you have particular utilities or particular infrastructure assets, which can then be essentially used as security.
Well, that's what we want to have in Ulaanbaatar city, right, where they have mini bonds. And mini bonds is exempted from tax rate in several cases.
Correct, in the US.
In the US. That's why the people buy, because if you buy on the coupon, you are tax exempted, right?
Correct.
And how long usually the terms would be on sovereign bonds? Americans are 25, 30 years.
Sure, and you have some perpetual sovereign bonds that have been issued as well.
Is it?
Well, it's very hard to do that unless you are a highly rated sovereign. Yes. So if you're looking at sovereigns that are likely to be in the same development category as Mongolia, they tend to be a lot shorter dated, not surprisingly, because investors typically will not be so secure in the long-term fiscal position of countries that don't have a track record.
For a country like Mongolia, where fiscal expenses are so high.
Clearly, fiscal position is something which investors look at when they're evaluating bonds.
Will sovereign bonds, in a way, discipline that government or not?
Yes, I think they do.
In terms of, will there be any restrictions in terms of lavish spending?
It's very rare for sovereign bonds to have covenants associated with them. Typically, the discipline is that if you have deficits, you need to ultimately continue to attract international investors to buy your sovereign bonds.
On one side, yes.
So the discipline is that if you default on your bonds or if you restructure, there's a period of time over which it's very difficult then to raise financing.
Yep.
And I think many of the emerging market economies in Latin America, for example, in the 80s, that either went through restructurings or default experiences. They were shut out.
A good example.
Yeah, they were shut out of the capital markets for a period of time.
Yeah, a couple of times Argentina did, and recently Greece had to ask more money from abroad, right?
Yeah, Greece has not
More deficit.
had a restructuring or defaulting, but they've been essentially supported by emergency facilities from the European Central Bank.
My warning is, at the level of 13% of deficit, 13% of GDP deficit, Greece was almost collapsed. And our deficit, this time it was 10%. And now they still promise to be around, worst time was about 10, then once it was even 5. Now it's going to be even more. And in that situation, with sovereign bonds together, it's not so much matching situation.
It depends a little bit on economic growth, of course, as well. If you have a growing economy, then, of course, that creates a future tax base that can be used to support sovereign bonds and debt, even if you have a primary deficit. So I don't think it's a simple question of what the size of the deficit is. It's a combination of size of deficit, future growth prospects, and, of course, the current level of the debt burden as well.
Yep. You are a mathematician.
I am a mathematician by background.
You have an honor from Cambridge.
Correct, yes.
I mean, how you became then a financier from mathematicians? What happened?
Well, mathematics is, I guess, at the heart of a lot of financial technology. And I've always been fascinated by economics. I've always viewed economics as being an interesting way of applying some of the tools that you learn about in mathematics to the real world. And it has real impact as well. It's something which shapes the life of everyone in society. So I think it was through my interest in economics and applying some of the technical skills that you learn in mathematics to real-world problems that caused me to be interested in finance. And finance is very much at the heart of how economies work. It's the fuel that drives economies.
So in Cambridge, when you studied, you have been studying about mathematic model of financing, development, financial modeling. What the particular sector you have been?
A lot of pure mathematics, actually. Most of the mathematics I studied was not specifically designed for finance or for economics, but mathematics is a toolkit, and many of the tools that you use, you can use them to support engineering, fluid mechanics, economics, finance. They have a wide range of applications. I did a lot of work in probability and statistics, and that clearly has a lot of relevance
in all life of society and in every profession. You can use that mathematics as a tool to model, foresee as much as possible based on your information you have, right?
I think predictions are always very difficult, and I think people can overuse mathematics, and a mathematical model is only as good as the assumptions that go into defining the model. And as we've seen in the financial crisis, excessive use of models and reliance on models without a bit of common sense and judgment can be very, very dangerous indeed. So I think mathematics is a very useful tool, but like any tool, a sharp knife or a screwdriver, if you don't use it in the right way with a lot of common sense, you can damage yourself.
What was, if you had any such a moment where you were feeling like you were very close to a reality met your mathematical expectations of modeling?
I think a lot of the early work that I did when I first went into consulting in financial services, which was around building credit rating models, in many cases for unusual types of lending. So when I started out in management consulting, my first project was working for a Scandinavian bank, helping them to build models to understand shipping finance. So shipping finance sounds like a very obscure and very complicated, very not related at all to mathematics. But we analysed hundreds and hundreds of different shipping loans, and then we did the same for oil and gas loans, for real estate loans. We looked at all the different factors that could affect the financial strength, the revenues, the expenses of the borrowers, and then we produced models that would predict, not with certainty, but would predict the likelihood that different borrowers would get into difficulty. And that proved extremely powerful. So I think that was probably the area where I came closest to real life, because you're talking about real assets, ships, oil and gas projects, and so on.
I'm asking this question because mathematics is a very popular discipline in this country. And now our students go abroad and get some prizes, and very popular. And yet, I'm not sure everybody understands that mathematics is not only science, but it's a great tool of finance, of any engineering, where you can, with this mathematics, can make a lot of money too.
I think that's very true. I think a lot of mathematicians go on to have very successful and very highly compensated careers in financial services. But I think also it's a very worthwhile discipline for other reasons as well. I think it teaches logical thinking.
Yes. That's the power of everything.
Which is the power of any academic discipline. I think it's fantastic, and it's a great asset and resource for Mongolia that you have so many talented young mathematicians, because I think that will be a great resource, a great human resource for the society in the future. But I think it has, aside from the financial and the economic benefits, because I think it encourages logical thinking, I think it's also good for the soul. It sounds like an odd thing to say, but the ability to think dispassionately about a problem, break it down into its component pieces. I think mathematics has a lot in common with law in that sense. It's a very logical, structured way of looking at problems, and as a result, I think it does make you potentially a more useful member of society in ways which go beyond your own job.
Young global leaders are people selected especially for their contribution to making this world, the state of the world we live in, better. And you are one of them, and I'm very happy to have you with my program. And come back to Mongolia, meet us again, and then we will have another very interesting cycle of conversation.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed being here for these last 2 days, and I very much hope to come to Mongolia again soon.
Thank you very much, Антони.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
төлөө эх орн чинь юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуухаас өмнө та өөрөө эх орныхон төлөө юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуу. Young Jargal